Matt Schauf of DraftSharks.com here to get you ready for your Week 13 fantasy football waiver wire runs. I will be going without my usual partner for the show, Jared Smola, this week. Condensed week for Thanksgiving means some changes to the schedule, some things working differently. That also includes no Thursday preview podcast this week. We got travel, we got family time. So sorry, you're only going to get one pod from us this week. But waivers are running as usual. We're all playing fantasy football this week. So I've got my buddy Shane Hallam sitting in Jared's spot to help me run through this week's options. And it's a little bit different, I think. It feels different than usual, Shane. For one thing, there's no buys. Like last week, we had a 6-team buy. For another thing, it's later in the season. So I think that we should be strategizing these waiver decisions differently. We're going to talk about that some as we go. So I'll get your thoughts on the differences by position, but we're going to go ahead and jump right into the players first thing. And we're going to start at quarterback. And if you do need a streaming quarterback this week, despite all the teams being, not on bye, Drake May remains in play. You can check our rankings this week to see if he makes sense for you. But we've talked about Drake May plenty on this show week after week. So we'll save him for later. You can see if he makes sense. I want to talk about some guys that have emerged more recently as maybe fantasy factors, maybe illusions. And that's what we're going to break down here. Let's start with Bryce Young. And before we get to his waiver viability for week 13, Shane, I know that you've been impressed by the way that Bryce Young has looked recently, right?
I think we've seen those improvements from him. When he got benched after week 2, it felt like it's over. Like his career's over, it's done. And then he gets the chance to go back in. And I think I've seen him really on film progress week to week, move into this Dave Canales offense really well and start to adapt. And against the Chiefs, which is a very tough defense, he actually faced the pressure well. So I think from a talent perspective, Bryce Young isn't as bad as he seemed early in the season.
And now this week he's got a nice matchup against the Bucs. They held the Giants to 7 points last week. I think the Giants are really holding themselves to 7 points at this stage. Before that, the Bucs allowed 4 straight top 5 quarterback weeks. The second best QB matchup on the season by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. And here comes Bryce Young off of his season high fantasy score. That season high, though, was still just QB 14 in a week that had 6 teams on bye. So just 26 teams still playing. I think that probably limits Bryce Young to just a starter in like 14 to 16 team leagues, super flex. I think he's mildly attractive to that end, but to me, he doesn't quite reach the level of being, viable for one quarterback leagues. What do you think?
I don't think the ceiling's there. I think that's the problem. Bryce Young's not going to throw for 3 touchdowns. You're just not going to get that ceiling. Like I said, QB 14, his best week. I think if you need a QB 2 week, you're probably safe plugging Bryce Young in, and that probably is in those 14, 16 team leagues. With no bye weeks this week, I don't see many situations where Bryce Young's worth starting still.
And just to tease the last edition of the Dynasty Trade Targets, I think he's going to be in the buy section of that, right?
He is. I've been going through today a lot of his film from the season, and I think in Superflex leagues, Bryce Young, I think his value is going to ascend in the offseason into next year.
Yeah, so look for more of that in there. I mean, normally when a guy does get benched that early in his career, we can kind of write him off, but might not be the case for Bryce Young. We'll see. We'll get more into Bryce Young for dynasty purposes in that Dynasty Trade Targets article. So check that out on DraftSharks.com later this week. Will Levis is the other quarterback we're going to talk about here, and he's been even better fantasy-wise than Bryce Young since his return from injury to the lineup. QB9, QB20, QB10 finishes the past 3 weeks. He gets Washington this week, which is still a negative QB matchup, but after that, some better spots. So what do you think of Will Levis, how he's played so far, and then we'll get to whether he makes sense for fantasy lineups?
I think similar to Bryce Young. Bryce Young had his best PFF grade for passing last week. Levis was his second highest last week. We see him finally getting into the Brian Callahan offense and starting to develop. They're taking the reins off a bit, letting him throw it up, hit some of those deep passes we've seen to Nick Westbrook-Akine. So I think if the matchups are right, I think Levis has that upside that Bryce Young doesn't. And I think Levis is a guy, if you do really need someone, maybe not this week, but the rest of the way, or even the fantasy playoffs, I think he gets interesting.
Yeah, I think he's interesting this week because it is such a light week on waivers. If you don't need anything, you kind of look around and see what makes sense. Maybe you get somebody for even cheaper in terms of the bidding dollars. And you're talking about the right matchup. Next week, Will Levis gets Jacksonville on another 6-team bye. So not only is there potential for him to score next week, but there are going to be some teams in need. Then after that, Cincinnati in week 15, potential shootout conditions where Cincinnati tends to boost opponent passing volume. And then Jacksonville again in week 17. Now, I can't sit here right now and say that Will Levis is somebody I would be willing to start in week 17, but now's the time where maybe I stash him and see how I'm feeling in a few weeks and see what my quarterback options are, because you do have to protect against some injuries at this time. The other matchup in there is the Colts in week 16. We'll see how both Levis and the Colts defense look by the time we get there, but certainly a positive finish to his schedule. Now, I could see Will Levis as a worthwhile starting option for week 14. I talked about that last remaining bye week. The teams that are out include the Ravens with Lamar Jackson, Washington with Jaden Daniels, Denver with Bo Nix, and Houston with CJ Stroud. So anybody who's leaning on any of those quarterbacks might need that quarterback in week 14. That might make it a good time this week to go ahead and stash Will Levis.
I think that's what you need to do. While the rest of your league mates are going to scramble when week 14 hits, you pick up Will Levis right now, week early, stash him on the bench, and I think you're well set against the Jaguars in week 14.
Never would have guessed that we'd get here to the end of November and be talking about how Will Levis might help you win a championship.
The NFL's crazy, right? It gets crazier every year. This is evidence of that.
Let's go to running back now. And Washington, we just talked about, has a bye coming up, but playing this week in week 13, and they might be doing so without Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler. Both those guys left last week's game with injuries. That likely leaves Jeremy McNichols as the lead running back. We'll watch the injury reports this week to see for sure. But at the moment, it seems like Jeremy McNichols is the most likely backfield leader there. If we see McNichols as the Washington lead running back this week, we're talking about a backfield that has scored the 7th most PPR points per game. So McNichols is one of those guys who, if you are in need at running back, is interesting on waivers this week.
I think he's a good pickup just because you get that pass catching advantage if you're in a PPR league or even a half PPR league. The pass catching upside, even if it's only one of Brian Robinson or Austin Eckler missing the game. The matchup against the Titans is not ideal for a running back, but that's where I think McNichols through the air gives you that advantage, and he's certainly going to do that even if they bring back Chris Rodriguez.
Not to mention revenge game potential for McNichols against the Titans, right?
Yeah, look, people forget. I mean, he had some snaps and some games where he participated for the Titans. So revenge matchup, if you're into that, some people are really into that. Then
Shane, who does not have a Jeremy McNichols Titans jersey hanging on their wall somewhere to remind them of those days? So I love bringing up the revenge game stuff just because it's fun, because you just talk about how a guy used to be on that team, especially if it's somebody that nobody has any business remembering playing for that team. But I'm certainly not factoring that in, although it would be fun. Ameer Abdullah up next on the running back list. The Raiders, I just talked about Washington running backs scoring fantasy points pretty well this season. Raiders running backs have not done so, collectively just 28th in PPR points per game. So this is not a situation worth targeting in general. That said, they do tie for 8th in the league in running back receptions to this point this season. Ameer Abdullah caught 5 balls last week as the backfield leader, has had 3 other catches in 4 other games this year, even with Alexander Mattison and or Zamir White around. So we'll see about Mattison and White this week, but there's room for Abdullah to be a PPR desperation play, right?
There is. It's ugly. Like, I don't think anyone, once again, went into the season saying, man, I'm going to start Ameer Abdullah on my fantasy team at some point. The 31-year-old who was a former day 2 pick, but he played 69 snaps, 47 routes run, 8 carries, 6 targets this past week with those 2 out. And I think even if we see Mattison or White, one of them back, I think Abdullah is still going to give that PPR upside. So I actually like him. He was productive. I think they like what they've seen from him. They've kept him around. He's a veteran. He knows what he's doing. I think Abdullah is a sneaky potential play this week.
And that team could just use somebody that they can count on to be where he's supposed to be at this point, because they don't have a whole lot of that going on.
Yeah, and they're going to be down, right? I mean, the Raiders are not going to be up, and that's where you see the passes come to Abdullah. So the game script is most likely going to be, especially against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, who can put up points. I think game script favors Abdullah. So they just need someone. I mean, it's been definitely the worst backfield, I think, in the NFL this year.
Yeah, and predictable heading into the season. And Antonio Pierce did say that he expects Sincere McCormick to get more opportunities this week. I will see what that means. So at the very least, I think it's maybe reason to not dive headfirst into Ameer Abdullah. But frankly, if you're diving headfirst into Ameer Abdullah this week, then your season's probably in trouble.
Yeah, hopefully is someone is hurt out there that you can get back. But the running back landscape hopefully is good enough where you don't have to start Abdullah unless it's a really deep league.
Abdullah is another one who might be stashable for week 14 in those desperation kind of situations because we've got Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry among those teams on bye for week 14. Last running back we'll talk about here is Antonio Gibson. And I got to be honest, Shane, I'm not bothering with him. What's the case for picking up Antonio Gibson this week? And then after that, I guess, are you?
I think it's just the play script. I mean, the Patriots are probably going to be underdogs and for every game the rest of the season. When they got down against Miami, they started playing Gibson a little bit more to have a little bit more of that pass blocking and someone that can get out there, they can target. And they still don't target him a ton. I think your hope is that Gibson earn some of those targets from Drake May moving forward. I think you can once again pick him up if you're desperate, kind of looking into the future, like we said, into that week 14 bye week mode that maybe he passes Stevenson, but I wouldn't overspend on Antonio Gibson and just out of a hope.
Yeah, this is, I think, the time of year to let go of the maybe guys on waivers, and that to me is the difference between Gibson and Ameer Abdullah. If the Patriots trail this week, then you're like, well, in that case, maybe they'll play Antonio Gibson more, and then maybe they'll target him more, which they haven't done. He hasn't caught more than one pass in a game since week 6. In the Raiders' case, if Zamir White and Alexander Mattison are out, and if the Raiders are trailing, then Ameer Abdullah is probably going to get more targets. So that's a key difference, even if you're in desperation territory with those guys. I would prefer to go with that if then kind of setup. And, talking about like handcuff type running backs where, looking at the San Francisco backfield, it's not a team to get excited about at the moment with how they're performing. And obviously Jordan Mason's not getting the ball when Christian McCaffrey's in there. But if Christian McCaffrey goes down, then Jordan Mason's going to lead that backfield. We've seen that happen. So I would rather target somebody like that than somebody like Antonio Gibson on waivers this week. And I think that's more of like a general idea concept, like we were talking about at the beginning of the show at this time of year, where I'm not super interested in chasing the guy who did something last week that might turn into something. I'd much rather take the player that I know is the number 2 back in this backfield that's showed me it's productive. I'd rather stash that guy on my bench, even if there's nothing recently to show me that he's going to help me soon. But I know that if the starter in front of him goes down, then I've got a real potential starting option for next week and then maybe the fantasy playoffs.
And I think that's the key. We're so late in the season that you should be planning for the fantasy playoffs. Even if you're on the bubble, plan as if you're going to make it, because if you don't, it doesn't matter. I think that's almost more important than getting 5-6 points from Antonio Gibson. I'm with you. I think Mason's a good target. We saw Kenneth Gainwell for the Eagles score a touchdown. I mean, if Saquon Barkley goes down, now you have a starting running back who got all the RB touches that Barkley didn't get in a high-powered offense. That's a fantasy playoff starter where Gibson, Abdullah, McNichols, all those guys are going to start for you in the fantasy playoffs. And if they do, you're probably cooked anyway.
Right. And, beyond just running back versus running back, I think it's a time of year where you go ahead and take guys like that over bench receivers. Those are the guys at wide receiver that are in our waiver article this week. There's not much attractive at the position. And I would think that most teams aren't really in need of a wide receiver option at this time of year with no teams on bye this particular week. So I'd be searching for any of those, clear handcuffs, not just any number 2 running back on any team, but the guys that we know are the number 2s, or at least are pretty certain are the number 2 running backs in case that starter goes down at any point. We've talked about Trey Benson a number of times on here. He's a lot more rostered now than he has been over the past few weeks, but still only 35% rostered on Sleeper, just 27% on Yahoo. So Trey Benson's one of those guys that I would look to stash this week. I mentioned Jordan Mason. I found him available in one of my Yahoo leagues, so I've got a claim in for him this week. Beyond Kenneth Gainwell that you just mentioned, Khalil Herbert is another kind of sneaky one where he hasn't done anything for Cincinnati yet. He's probably on most waiver wires, but if they liked anything else that they had in that backfield behind Chase Brown, they wouldn't have made the trade for Khalil Herbert. So I think that's the kind of guy that I would be more willing to stash versus Antonio Gibson or even Ameer Abdullah if I don't need a desperation play this week. I'd rather go ahead and take, Bengals number 2 running back and stick him on my roster.
And do what Matt did. I mean, go to your waiver wire and look. You might be surprised. We saw Braylon Allen was one of the most dropped running backs last week. If Breece Hall goes down, he's a starter. Jalen Wright is still out there for the Miami Dolphins. So look for those running backs that maybe you don't even expect to be on the waiver wire, like Jordan Mason, who might be there. I think it is a much better strategy because none of the receivers on our waiver wire article this week are going to help you in the playoffs either.
Now, that said, are there any wide receivers that you're interested in or targeting this week?
In deeper leagues, I think if I need kind of a deeper shot, Devon Vele, the wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, the rookie, who's the clear number 2 there at this point. We've seen Bo Nix really ascend to be a dynamic quarterback, not just for fantasy, but in real life. And Vele has 18 targets, 14 catches, 185 yards and 1 score over the last 3 games. So 6 catches for 80 yards this week. Once again, not a guy that you want to end up having in your starting lineup, but he almost acts, I think, a little bit as a wide receiver handcuff. Cortland Sutton goes down. I think we see Vele then potentially in some good matchups be someone that you can utilize. So if we're talking 14, 18 team leagues, he does have the week 14 bye. I'm stashing him more for looking ahead to the Colts, the Chargers, the Bengals, and the fantasy playoffs.
It can't hurt to stash a guy that Sean Payton himself has compared to Marcus Colston. The only tight end in our article this week is Luke Schoonmaker. That shows you how depleted the position is at this point. He did score a touchdown with Jake Ferguson out. It looks like Jake Ferguson's going to be out again this week. Luke Schoonmaker, you interested in him this week?
I think I'm interested in him if I really need that spot start. Schoonmaker was pretty heavily used and was contending for that number 2 receiving option for the Cowboys. Playing the Giants this week, it's a negative matchup, but still some maybe potential in the red zone. He outsnapped Brevin Spanford, the rookie tight end, who a lot of people picked up instead. I think Schoonmaker's the guy there. Once again, I'm not picking him up unless I need to plug in a tight end right now. That's probably in a deeper league.
Yeah, don't overrate the fact that he scored a touchdown last week. Make sure you look beyond the, fantasy points from the week. Did run more routes and play more snaps than Brevin Spanford, but also only ran a route on 59% of Dallas's dropbacks, only beat Spanford by 4 routes. Like, to me, that's not even a big enough gap to guarantee that Schoonmaker does the same thing this week. The 4 targets did tie for second on the team, but also just 12.5% target share. 6 Cowboys had between 2 and 4 targets. So a fluid situation, and one that's expected to add Brandon Cooks back to the mix this week. So if you absolutely need a tight end, go for it. But certainly Luke Schoonmaker, I don't think is somebody worth targeting this week. Let's wrap this up with streaming defenses for both this week and next week. And I think looking ahead is especially useful at this time of year, Shane. Week 13 to begin. You do our streaming defense article every week. So why don't you tell me who the top streaming defense target is for week 13?
It's pretty easy. It becomes the play anyone against Tommy DeVito show. And we have the Cowboys against the Giants. Tommy DeVito had a 17.2% sack rate last year as a starter. And this past week against Tampa wasn't much better. 11.42% sack rate. Tampa had 4 sacks. His average time to throw on those sacks was 2.4 seconds. And the Cowboys, now Micah Parsons looks like he's at full strength. They had 4 sacks in Jaden Daniels last week and held that team in check for 3 quarters. I think the Cowboys defense is kind of getting back to what we thought they might be before the season, and now they get maybe the worst starting quarterback in the NFL.
It may be, because Tommy DeVito's got a forearm issue this week, so we might see Drew Lock this week. Now, if it's Drew Lock and not Tommy DeVito, do you think that changes anything about the Cowboys defense as a play?
I think I'd still play them. I'm not as confident. I think Drew Lock's actually the better player, so I don't think the sack rate necessarily would be as high, but Drew Lock still, we've seen the Drew Lock experience, and it's not good. He's not an accurate thrower. He is more of a statue in the pocket at times. I think the Cowboys still be my top play for the week.
Yeah, his career sack rate is fairly low, 4.8%, but he has thrown almost as many interceptions for his career as touchdowns. So I think zero people have ever said, no, I'm not playing that defense if it has to face Drew Lock. Still a solid matchup behind a bad offensive line. I mean, we know that Tommy DeVito has an issue allowing sacks, but if the defense is getting to you in 2.4 seconds, most quarterbacks are going to have some sack trouble there. I think the Colts defense is also an option this week. They've got the Patriots. 3+ sacks in 2 straight games and 3 of the past 4 for that Colts defense. The Patriots, meanwhile, over the past 4 games have allowed 12 sacks, 8 turnovers. They're averaging just 18.3 points per game. I think the lack of scoring potential to the Patriots raises the floor, makes them a safer matchup. There's upside to the Colts with their pass rush lately, especially since DeForest Buckner came back. But I like the floor being up in this matchup with the Patriots. It makes me feel a little bit safer about taking a shot on what's still like a flimsy Team D play.
And we've seen Drake May turn the ball over in each of the past 4 games. I mean, you can almost guarantee, similar to a Will Levis, that there's going to be a turnover. So I think that floor is great.
Week 14, a streaming defense. Yeah, who do you like there?
I like the Cincinnati Bengals here going up against the Dallas Cowboys. And we talked about DeVito and Drew Lock, but Cooper Rush might also contend for the worst quarterback in the league. That did beat the Washington Commanders, so maybe there's some ascension to the Cowboys offense. But I think the Bengals defense has been one in fantasy where we're like, oh, this defense is really bad because there's been a ton scored against them. But, we have Trey Hendrickson, who we know can get to the quarterback as an edge rusher. They definitely have the ability to create turnovers. I think the Bengals, like up against a Cooper Rush-led Dallas Cowboys offense with Rico Dowdle at running back, even with Brandon Cooks back, I think the Bengals have a solid floor and maybe some upside with some of the big playability.
I think Cowboys fans, if they're listening, would probably rather you didn't keep naming players on the current Cowboys roster. But yeah, the Bengals defense is bad. They do have some upside players, though. And if you can score some points and force a Cooper Rush-led offense into trying to keep up with you, then you're just setting the table for turnovers, big plays, a good defensive day. Shane, I made an early decision this week on what I'm going to put into our expert moves article as my move, and it is pick up the Arizona Cardinals defense now ahead of next week. Because first off, they're very available. Just 16% rostered on Sleeper right now, 21% rostered on ESPN, and they're at Minnesota this week. So I don't think that's going to rise a whole lot. And I wouldn't recommend playing Arizona this week, although you can work out as a team defense against Sam Darnold, as he has reminded us at times this year. But really, I'm picking up Arizona for the way the schedule finishes. The Cardinals are coming off 3 straight double-digit fantasy scores by ESPN scoring. They held all 3 of those opponents to 10 points or less. That includes Seattle this past week. They get the Seahawks again in week 14 at home in Arizona. After that come upside matchups against the Patriots and the Panthers. So I think if you stash Arizona this week, and I think this is the time of year to get rid of a bench tight end or wide receiver or, whatever's sitting there that's really not going to do anything for you the next few weeks. Take a defense that you can at least platoon with another, or maybe just start for 3 straight weeks, as I'm saying with Arizona here. I already put a claim in for Arizona in my Yahoo League with waivers running tonight. So I'm going to make sure that I don't post this podcast until later so none of my league mates can hear what I'm saying about it. But I really think this Arizona defense is looking like it could make a difference in some fantasy matchups the rest of the way.
I like that. I like it a lot. I mean, their defense has actually been pretty solid, plus the matchup. If you're scared about the Rams in week 17 and you followed Matt's advice and picked up the Colts this week, they're a defense to keep around for the fantasy playoffs as well, especially at the end against the Titans and the Giants in the last 2 weeks of the fantasy playoffs.
Remember, no preview pod coming this week because of holiday travel, but you can find more streaming defense info in Shane's weekly streaming defenses article. That's on draftsharks.com right now, as is the waiver wire pickups article that Shane and Kevin collaborate on every week. You can find my IDP waiver wire pickups article as well. That leads off with a young Colts defender who's on a hot streak right now. And of course, you can always see exactly who's available in every one of your synced leagues by checking the free agent finder on draftsharks.com. It highlights targets for your team. It highlights players that you can now consider dropping. That's a new feature to the Free Agent Finder. There are a variety of options for how to sort the candidates in your specific league, including looking at that upcoming week that we were just talking about, week 14 in this case, 16 buys. So there are going to be other teams in your league looking to that week, and there are going to be people in your league who don't do that looking until next week. So get ahead of that now, beat them. The Free Agent Finder, those waiver articles, this show, and everything else we do are really done for the goal of making Draft Sharks your unfair advantage.